Columbus Day. So,
Yeah.
so Keith, are you ready to tell us what horror is?
He's hoping we just figured it out without
Yeah,
him,
I
I guess.
thought you guys had already talked about it for
Well,
an
we're
hour.
about halfway there, probably, but your
Yeah.
insight would be appreciated.
Okay, well, when I think horror, I usually am inclined to think of things that have like a building dread, an impending sense of doom in a way, or something horrible that's going to happen. And so that creates a wide range of movies and stories that can fit that I don't know, that description. I think horror for me becomes an umbrella. Like I think there's these slow burn type horror movies which I love, though, and then there's the thriller types. Those are the exciting types. Those are the ones with jump scares and stuff like that. I think there's the classic horror movies that have like the creepy music and the moody atmosphere, and it when you're watching it, it just makes you feel a little uneasy when you're watching it. And I think for me, that's a horror movie. It makes you feel uneasy in some way, not it's maybe even queasy at times. I think horror can also incorporate terror. I think we use those interchangeably, but I think terror is a little different, or it's a subset of horror, which is more of just that absolute body mortifying terror, that feeling of just you're just out of control, and that feeling that happens, that like immediacy of threat is upon you.
Your nervous system basically going, we gotta get safe somehow.
Yeah, I'm not in a safe place. That can,
You're
that's
beyond
the terror.
dread.
Yeah.
That actually, they made that distinction in the 18th century. Anne Radcliffe, the one that Justin had mentioned.
Okay. Well, I missed that part, but yeah, okay.
Horror and terror.
Yeah, that's why I think of for me, this is me, is that I consider Frankenstein like the greatest novel ever, but it's also the greatest horror novel. And it's just, as you
read science fiction.
And it's science fiction. It's like so much. And yeah, horror could be science fiction. Like Alien for me is one of the
we talked about
movies,
Alien earlier.
Of all time.
You notice
right?
Planet of the Vampires there representing Alien, the idea of horror and science fiction. Go ahead, Keith.
Right. Okay, but Frankenstein for me is like the go-to, the book, not the movie. I love the movie, but it's different. And but the book itself is just a creeping dread throughout. I mean, if you read it, it just keeps moving slowly towards the inevitability of where it's going. And the film's not the same kind of horror. There's not quite that inevitability because they're creating franchise out of it.
The film is not as tight. I mean, it has atmosphere. But it doesn't have that accretion of, like, are you guys familiar with this literary term, the unity of effect? I've talked about this a lot in my videos. So unity of effect is used a lot by people to describe, like, especially horror short stories, where you have the premise and it's lean. There's nothing. There's no tangents. There's no extra characterization or whatever. There's like show, don't tell, and it's all building. Every element is building toward one payoff at the end that's just intense beyond words. So people who write short stories, I'm not good at writing short stories, by the way, but people who do write short stories, that's their thing. I'm more into like there's a big story and I have room for characterization and other bits that don't go toward one effect. That's a different thing, long form storytelling. But with short stories, it's tight. So with movies, it's tight too. And a movie, I think, embodies the unity of effect thing for horror is Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There's no extra fat on that, from the first beginning with the sunspots and the music concrete, all the way to her screaming in the pickup truck. You have been building that entire thing to an intolerable level. Your nervous system is overloaded, and that's where you talk. Terror reminded me of that. To me, that is absolutely, and there's nothing in there that's distracting you from it. Like Texas Chainsaw 2, it has some humor, it has some gore, but it doesn't really have like, okay, at the end, you have a little dread, but it's not like, oh God, at the ending, this is going to be, they kind of try to do it at the ending, but by then it's like, well, it's almost an afterthought. But in Texas Chainsaw 1, it's like, who the hell's going to, well, like the poster said, who will survive and what will be left of them,
Right.
not just physically, but up here. And obviously there's nothing left really of Sally by the end of that fucking movie, but she survived. So, and you're with her on that whole ride, even though she's not the most interesting character, but she's smarter than all the other ones, except Franklin, who's really smart, but he's kind of annoying, but he's also disabled. So, so they really turn it towards, omens and signs and portents. Like I said, the sunspots, the astrology mentions, the old man in the graveyard laying down his back, babbling, the insane sculpture where they wired the corpse onto the cemetery stone. It's just amazing, and it pays off.
Yeah.
For my money, if you're a full-on horror movie, you don't survive. And that's part of the horror, is that there's a point where the viewer and the character have to realize there's no other resolution here. They have to come to that point of like realizing I'm not getting away. And that I think, as the viewer vicariously, that's where we really feel it as a viewer, when you realize there's no happy outcome here, and you're still continuing on the ride. And
that kind of horror really affected me when I was a kid. It really blew my mind, and in a way, even though it was very dark and powerful and scary and grim, I have to admit it kind of seduced me more towards horror, to where I could like get over my squeamishness about gore, and because there was like these feelings that I was, the dread is part of it, and what you just described, all this kind of stuff were kind of addictive to me, and and so I began searching, or not searching, but being open to those kind of feelings. And the dread thing is something I want to get back to, but Kaelyn, you were going to say something.
Yes, because the comments y'all were just having back and forth gave me another idea that I think for me, like what makes a like true horror and or good horror film, or story for that matter, is that the key thing is that it keeps that sustained like building the whole time. They don't let you off the hook early. You might get a moment reprieve, but if it's good, they can throw you back into it like that, and there you go. And a good example I can think of is earlier in our conversation we were talking about some of Jordan Peele's movies, because Nope came up, and oh gosh, I always forget the title of his most recent one. No, that is Nope. I'm sorry.
That is Us.
That one is
Us
Nope.
and Get Out.
Us and Get Out and Us. And for me, the reason that Nope isn't as scary is because you find out what's going on relatively early in the film, and then the rest of it is about, okay, now how do we fight it? Whereas I think if it was more of a like pure true horror film, you wouldn't have found out until the end what was going on, and you'd have that inevitable, and they're screwed. But
that's where I think the distinction is between just a straight up horror movie and a monster movie. Nope became a monster movie.
It did. Yes,
and the rules change when it's a monster movie. Anyway, that's my interruption.
No, I think that's a really good distinction. And then like to compare it to Us, because I just watched that one last night, and I think that out of the three, Us is definitely the scariest one. I also personally think it's the best one of the three that he's done. And that one has that sustained all the way through the movie. You do not get a break. He does not let you off the hook. You are just horrified by what you are seeing. You are terrified. You want this family to survive. You want them to be okay. And arguably, like what you were saying, Keith, with like you realize that they're not going to be okay. They might have literally physically survived, but you get the reveal that Lupita Nyong'o's character Addie was actually the tethered version of her the whole time. Yep. The family has fundamentally changed.
Yep.
So they didn't survive.
They're not letting you off the hook even at the end. And that's the key point where, it's not necessarily about a literal survival. Sometimes it's a mental, it's conceptual, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So that just clicked for me. And I think for me, that's really like key to what horror is and what makes good horror.
And I think there's room for both. I mean, there's different storytelling modes. And I mean, I'm all for looser ones that, have atmosphere here and there and characterization. It just depends on what you're trying to do or what you're trying to say. But yeah, as far as the on point ones and the unity effect, I don't think that they're necessarily more horror than other movies that aren't like that. But I do think they are a very, strong example of horror, of how powerful it can be when you do make it that coiled and tight. But I don't expect every movie to be like, very few really are anymore.
Right.
So when I do see one, I'm like, whoa, what the hell? And there are a few newer ones coming out like that, and that's nice to see,
Yeah.
Night of the Living Dead, I felt, was generally like that, but Dawn of the Dead is kind of like that, but in a way it's not. It's also an epic. It's also a canvas where they kind of show the world and these characters. So it's not like every single thing is like building that dread. You kind of have a little more release.
Well, Dawn of the Dead plays around with a little bit of campy.
Hold on, Scott. Hold on.
Yeah, Dawn of the Dead incorporates a bit of campy humor that was completely missing from Night of the Living Dead. There's no humor in Night of the Living Dead. It is just continuing on in a horrible situation. But Dawn of the Dead does give us these moments of humor, and especially a few campy moments, and because it was a satire. Versus Night of the Living Dead, there was some commentary happening, societal commentary, but it was not a satire. So it's interesting because they they're related, but they're very different approaches within that same I don't know, realm or whatever.
I think Day of the Dead is the bleakest because it has the bleakness of the first movie, but then it also does have the wide open kind of characterization and what's happening with the world that's in Dawn of the Dead. Except there's really, unlike in Dawn of the Dead, these people in Dawn of the Dead, especially Peter, they're survivors. I mean, even though Peter almost kills himself at the end, he's still like, fuck this, I'm a survivor. And in Day of the Dead, there are survivors, like Sarah obviously is one, though she doesn't really realize it about herself, I think, until she bonds with John, who's kind of like, let's go to an island and make some babies. And she's like, is this possible? And they survive, which turns the whole thing on the end, of Night of the Living Dead. Not only do 2 people survive, like in Dawn, but 3 survive. So there's a little hope, but that hope is really, I didn't expect it. It's tenuous because it's so bleak for most of the movie that it's like, they're going through it and they're like going through it scientifically, mathematically. We've run out of options, and we're depending on this one guy to, give us some insight. And he's basically acting out his childhood psychosexual weirdness on these zombies. Not that some of it isn't successful. Obviously, Bub is a step forward. But it's not really helping everybody to survive or prosper or anything.
Hey, can I say something?
Yes.
Yeah. I wanted to mention that, like in a lot of the earlier 18th century novels, just to sort of pick up from there, you have these at the very beginning, they don't really have much of a climax, but towards the end of the 1790s, you have this distinct pattern showing up in these Gothic novels where everything becomes more and more tense towards the end. So that, you build to a real climax at the very end. And you didn't get this, like, say, the 1760s or 70s. So there's something there. But then when you go over to like 1960s and 70s, what I find really fascinating is the fact that a lot of the horror usually has a nice pat ending. The good people survive, the bad ones don't, that kind of thing. You see this all the Hammer movies. You see this in things. Let's see, what's The Blood of a Vampire in, I think, 1959 or so. Like all of these have good solid endings. It's not until the 1970s, I think the early 70s, where you start having this sort of like question of of a happy ending. Like I mean, like the one for just to mention 2 weeks ago, the one with this ghost story, the new house where the little baby is possessed by the ghost. I mean, that is one example. And I think all the vampire films too, like in Grave of a Vampire, you have the vampires that are surviving. So I think, but then, like say in The Changeling, the one I talked about last week, I mean, I think what is really fascinating, that is one movie that just keeps building and building and building tension throughout. And there is a clear ending at the end, but I mean, it is still a horrifying movie. And I've always wondered why, excuse me?
I just said it is, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So anyway, so I mean, but I do not know why it is not a popular horror film. For some reason,
it's been reappraised. I mean, if you get into the whole,
it's sort of a cult movie, right? It's more of a
if you get into the circles that we kind of travel in, collecting this kind of stuff, and since it came out on Blu-ray, it's definitely found a new generation of strong admirers for sure.
But I think she's right for some reason, because I remember when Changeling came out, and I was one of those that went and saw it in the theater. But it is one of those that just seemed to kind of disappear. It didn't. It didn't seem to be popular on the rewatch circuit. So it's nice to see it kind of being. It's kind of nice to see it getting a resurgence and a reevaluation with the remaster and stuff that's recently come out.
Because Stephen King has admired it. I mean, he has admired it. And I think it did get the Genie Awards and the Canadian awards. So it must. I mean, it must have been quite effective at that time. But it just for some reason.
Yeah, I remember it. I mean, one reason I didn't rent it. I mean, it was always on my long to rent. But the reason it wasn't really bumped up more is because I think I did kind of take it for granted that maybe it was going to be a little quieter. It wasn't kind of the horror movie that I was trying to see a lot of in the 90s. But then once I kind of got over that phase where it's like, I'm open to whatever. Then it was hard finding it for streaming. But as soon as I find it free for streaming, like the day I saw it there, I watched it. It was only like 2 years ago. And I thought it was great.
Yeah. Films like The Changeling and Ghost Story, they had some inherent problems. They had casts that were of very popular actors who were popular 30 years earlier. That's not going to appeal to the youth crowd. And they didn't necessarily have that scene that everybody could go and tell their friends about. I mean, what are you going to say about Changeling? There's this scene with a baby carriage on the stairs. They're going to look at you like, okay.
Did you see that story in the theater, Bill?
It's hard to describe dread. It's hard to, say, the scene where a head falls out of the glove compartment. Oh my God. It's like, that does sound good.
Well,
it's hard to describe
you're right.
a slow burning.
I mean, when I was around the same time period, right, with Friday the 13th came out. I mean, all of us are telling our friends, this arrow comes through his throat.
The money shot,
right? And
money shot's a good way to put it. And we are refer to pornography again.
Absolutely. That's where I got.
That reminds me of like with Burnt Offerings. I watched that with the audio.
Same era.
I watched it with the audio commentary, and they're talking about how the novel didn't really have an ending, and so like we ended it. We had like the chimney fall down on the and like I read the novel. The novel is really good. The ending is just with the father character just sitting catatonic by the pool, and that's really where it ends. And it's kind of like what we're talking about there. But they's like, no, we gotta have this slam bang ending where they get crushed with the chimney,
right?
And like. I actually think the ending in the novel is a little more effective.
Did y'all ever see the movie Deadly Blessings?
Yeah.
Wes Craven. That was there was a thing about that. This is another thing that you can do with a horror movie is I was terrified to go see that as a kid.
I was too.
Because based on the trailer, just because of the scene in the trailer of her laying in bed asleep with her mouth open and it tracking a spider down to her mouth from the sky or from the roof.
Live up to the trailer.
They put that in the trailer, and that was
God.
I want to see.
No, I get that. Like I'm not even afraid of spiders. I actually quite like them, but
I've seen that.
Not in your mouth.
I've seen the movie
not
since
in your
then.
mouth.
It ain't that scary, but the trailer when I was 13 was like very scary.
Yeah.
You know,
there's thing,
sorry,
I was just gonna say that's another thing with the unity of effect thing that you were talking about, Henry. Like trailers also, how do you condense, this is a scary movie that you should see, into a few seconds, really. You know, like most trailers are what, about how long? Like, you know, less than a minute, I would guess. I don't know.
Teasers are less than a minute.
About 2.5.
2.5 to 3 minutes.
Yeah.
Really? Okay. I guess they just go fast for me, but
well, there's a lot of teaser trailers now.
So
yeah.
Too often they give away too much.
Condense that and like give away enough that people know why they should see it, but not so much that they go and they're like, well, I feel like I already saw it.
Well, they've gotten bad because
a lot of trailers.
They don't respect
trailers
the
are bad now. Yeah,
there was in the great golden age of movie horror trailers. You know, it would be great. It'd be like The Tingler or something, and they would have that voiceover and going, "Be sure to see it the first night."
Yeah,
just terrifying experience.
I grew up with the '70s trailers, and they scared the hell out of me. But some of those guys with the
original trailer for The Wizard of Oz just had like a spinning wheel and a guy shouting, "What is Oz?"
Oh, wow!
Really?
I feel like now a lot of trailers now are like they're all bad, like all of them, pretty much all of them. Either because they tell you like everything and it makes me just not want to see it, or they tell me nothing and I get to the end of the trailer and I'm like, so you just showed me a bunch of clips and then the title, and I'm just like, that tells me nothing about the movie. That was people talking and screaming.
Yeah, they don't know how much that's a turn off.
Okay. You know, and it's like, why should I go see this? And that's not even.
I'll tell you my favorite.
That's like everything.
My favorite trailer for a horror film is Hatchet for the Honeymoon, where you get the music and you get the scenes they're just like really wild. So you get some idea what it's about, what it feels like, but it doesn't really give away the plot.
Bava's trailers were always good, even though he did throw money shots in ones like Blood and Black Lace. Just he had to do some of that.
You know, probably the ultimate movie trailer for a horror movie to me would probably be that initial trailer for Alien.
Yes.
You remember the in space, no one can hear you scream thing?
Yeah. It was mostly an egg.
Just that they gave you nothing but horror in that moment, and it just like, oh yeah, I gotta go get scared. Right
now I want to know what I'm
yeah, the music, everything.
I gotta find out.
I gotta find out what this is gonna be all about.
But I'll tell you the worst. If you ever saw What Lies Beneath, it's got a twist. It's got a twist, and the twist should be shocking, and it would have been if I hadn't watched the trailer. Where clearly a character, a character who up to now in this film I've been watching has been nothing but a good guy. But I remember the trailer where he's being not so good, and once you realize that, you're like, well, I think I know exactly what's about to happen. And bing, ba-ding, it did.
Yep. Could you imagine? Can you imagine if they gave it away on The Sixth Sense? I mean, imagine that if they did that in The Sixth Sense, gave it away in the trailer. Like, it would be like, why am I watching this?
To be fair, I figured The Sixth Sense out fairly early in the movie.
I did too.
I didn't. I mean, because I didn't know there was a twist. If I known there was a twist, I would have.
I heard there was a twist. It's one thing
if it's explicitly spoiled for you, and another if you figure it out while you're watching it and get to feel clever, like, oh, I bet I know what's going on here. And
where
that's happening a lot.
I figured out the village, like when the guy said, "Well, we're gonna get stuff from the outside world." I was like, I knew it wasn't a period piece at that moment.
Right.
And it kind of helps that my grandmother was raised by the Shakers, so I kind of knew about societies like that. But I didn't hate the film for that. A lot of people hated The Village.
Which film is this again?
The Village by M. Night Shyamalan.
Yeah. I didn't care for that one. I didn't hate it. It was just
that's another one I've seen on some of those is it horror or not kind of lists.
The Village, I don't know. I wouldn't call that.
I think
horror.
Shyamalan is horror, but I think he's horror because he wants to market to horror. I don't really think he has much to say in the horror genre personally. I mean, he definitely wants to be part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if of Shyamalan's movies, I would definitely say that most recent one of his was supposed to be horror. I think Signs is a horror movie.
At the Door.
Yeah.
And I think the Sixth Sense falls into the horror genre just because it's a ghost story, so it's going to be in there, even though it's more of like a mystery thriller kind of a thing.
Yeah.
But
it Sixth Sense is one of those like creepy horror films.
But if you deal with ghosts, in my opinion, it's a horror movie unless it's just a straight up comedy.
Sure.
Oh,
Kaelyn,
the one movie about ghosts. I mean, it was just called Ghosts, but it wasn't so much about hauntings as the idea of death. And I think it came out around 2016 or 17.
Is this a fiction or a documentary?
This is no. It was actually it was a movie. It was a film.
Okay.
Not a documentary.
Okay.
And I think it was called Ghost.
Okay. I don't know that one.
Not the one with Whoopi Goldberg.
A ghost story?
No, not Patrick Swayze.
Because that's thinking about death.
That's not horror to me.
Who's in it?
That's a ghost story that's not a horror movie. Yeah.
Hey, I got to go a little bit, but Kaelyn
Ghost at least had elements of horror with the dark spirits coming.
Sure. Oh yeah, that was very
right. Sure.
But Kaelyn had a good question on her thing about can horror comedies, if it's a horror comedy, is it really horror?
Yeah. And I was really hoping to bring that up while Justin was still here, since he mentioned horror comedies a little bit when he was giving his spiel. But like horror comedies, it's like if you aren't actually scared while you're watching it and all of it is just funny, is it still horror or not? And like one example that comes to mind for me of like a horror comedy where I'm like, that wasn't scary, is like Shaun of the Dead. It's hilarious. It's a bunch of
Abbott and
tropes,
Costello meet the Frankenstein monster. That's horror.
I think that's like the perfect example is that one.
But it's silly as hell, but it's horror.
I mean, because it still incorporates the elements of the mood of horror, the topic of horror.
A comedy horror I really love is Night of the Living Deb.
I haven't seen that.
Night of the Living Deb.
Yes.
Night of the Living Dead.
That's funny.
Yes, it's very good.
Think about one.
Shaun of the Dead. Shaun of the Dead. That's a straight up
Shaun of the
flick.
Dead.
It's a horror.
Shaun of the Dead is like my go-to example of a horror comedy.
Yeah, What We Do in the Shadows. That's a horror movie, but it's also hilarious. Yeah.
Oh my God, What We Do in the Shadows. God.
But most of those movies to me are not scary at all or disturbing at all, but they are funny, and they do definitely play on the horror tropes to get the humor, especially if they're well done,
Mad
Monster Party is a horror movie.
Night of the Living Deb, where the one person gets mistaken. It's like, it's like he's got cerebral palsy, and the guy's like, that guy actually does have cerebral palsy, but he's been turned into a zombie.
Oh.
This one doesn't. I don't know. This one doesn't sound appealing to me. No offense.
Yeah, I was gonna make a joke about Night of the Living Dead. Sounds terrifying because both mothers-in-law that I've had have been named Debbie, so that's frightening. And one of them is in fact dead, so she could come back as a zombie, and that would be terrifying.
Deb is actually a nice character in this film.
She's
a very endearing, quirky character stuck in a zombie apocalypse.
Wasn't there a movie about killer rabbits? And I don't know if that one's supposed to be.
Yes, Night of the Lepus.
I just immediately thought of Monty Python.
I have a copy.
Yeah.
Yep, Night of the Lepus, classic movie about monster rabbits.
It's a strict horror movie. Science makes a mistake and grows something big, and the mistake was that they picked rabbits to grow big. And I don't care how big they are. I don't care if you smeared red jelly on their face. They're not scary. I could be being killed by a killer rabbit. My last move will be to pet him on his big old bunny ears.
Yeah.
So fun fact.
Did it better.
Fun little bit of Jordan Peele fact, though, because since I did just rewatch Us, my wife and I were trying to look up like the reasons for the tethered eating rabbits, like why rabbits, other than they breed like crazy and therefore a good food source makes sense. Yep. And apparently Peele just finds them really, really creepy, and everybody finds different animals scary, and it's just
rabbits have been used quite a bit. Yeah.
Donnie Darko, that freaking mask is crazy.
I love Donnie Darko, and yes, that mask is terrifying.
Yeah, I think the reason why some people find rabbits particularly creepy is just they have that lack of expression because
they're
of
dead,
the way
dead-eyed.
It's a total dead-eyed look. There's no muscles there to give them any kind of
they have that animal look, and that's a scary look. And I would associate that with being prey. A rabbit doesn't have to have any cerebellum. It just looks down, there's food. But then if you've ever looked into the eyes of a bear, you get the same blankness, only that's the blankness of a shark that all it does is eat, and you're looking at the eye, which predator, way too close. That's terrifying.
Bears are just scary.
Grizzly Man is a horror movie. That's a documentary.
Oh God!
Grizzly Man is terrifying. It's terrifying. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
I don't know.